Hello, Paul here, your lecturer. I'm pre-recording weeks 2 and 3's lectures, or at least giving you a brief introduction to them. Now I'm doing this so that you can hit the ground running early and you've got some insight to work with when talking in your initial meetings with your German partners. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this session, we're going to look at week 2's material, perspectives on culture, and I'm going to briefly introduce the main concepts and areas that we'll be looking at. And then in a separate recording, I'll cover week 3, where we look more at national differences in culture. This is in effect a flipped lecture. If you haven't heard of flipped classrooms before, what it means is that you get some of the material up front and then we use the class to reflect upon this. But this is only a very brief introduction to the material. I will be doing the full lecture within the classes themselves in weeks 2 and 3. And in fact, if you watch this, you'll be in a good position to stop me during my presentation, ask me questions and ask for points of clarification. So in week 2, the lecture will look at some of the initial thoughts and definitions. We'll be looking at different perspectives on culture because there are different ways of looking at culture, different paradigms, people coming from different perspectives, but also differences between people from different parts of the world. We'll be looking at some of the categorization of organisation culture and some of the consequences at the international level, which feeds into next week, or into week 3, I should say. Okay, so in week 1, we did a little bit of background, some of the big theses on globalization, on culture, on conflict, and so on and so forth. And as I say, we're going to challenge some of these views of the world in what we're doing. We're taking a critical perspective. But this week, we're going to have a more practical view of culture, and this is really geared up. It's a very applied appreciation to help you start thinking about and tackling the consulting project. So we're going to look at what the role of culture is in terms of our value systems, and we'll be looking at different viewpoints as well. We'll be looking at an anthropological understanding of the culture. We'll be considering whether globally we're disintegrating as opposed to integrating. And also we'll be thinking about international business and the fact that international business and corporations often span more than the nation state. There is a video that you can watch as well, a video on organisational culture, and I've made this available in week 2's folder of the KLE. We'll probably be watching this in class as well. There are many different definitions of culture, and in fact these go back a long way, well in excess of 100 years in fact. But to give a fairly recent one, I say recent, 20 years ago, and one that pertains through to today, International Business Textbook by Michael Chinkota talked about an integrated system of learned behaviour, and those being characteristics of any group or members of any given society. Tyler broadens that out a bit, or broadened it out in terms of the fact that when people talk about culture, they don't just talk about organisation culture or differences in society. We also bring into culture things such as beliefs, arts, customs, and so on. So it's talking about culture being a complex whole that brings all these things together. And when we look back at later definitions from the 50s and from the 30s, we can see there's this notion that any society or any grouping of people have certain characteristics, ideas, standards, values that are common amongst them and differentiate them or cause them to be different from people from other societies. Some people talk about culture as being values, assumptions and beliefs, and that's a good way of thinking about it. The notion that there is a commonality in terms of the value system, and those differ from one culture to another, that within any culture people will make basic assumptions about life and being and so on, which are actually quite different elsewhere, so sometimes we don't see our own culture. And thirdly, beliefs. This is sort of driven, when I talk about beliefs, not just religious beliefs, but also underlying beliefs on what's right, what's wrong, and how we should conduct ourselves and live our lives going forward. And clearly there are differences and sources of misunderstandings between different cultures there. Okay, so some of the cultural factors, well, they're really important elements, but often the least understood by, not just by managers, but by people more broadly. And this causes considerable conflict between people from different countries, different ethnicities, different cultures and so on. And I've just grouped together there some of the different elements that are the sources of learning behaviour and culture between countries, but also can cause confusion and misunderstanding because of differences from one culture to another. And in the lecture we'll unpack those a little bit more. But what we can say is that those particular factors, when we look at those, we can see that those elements, and particularly the variations from one nation or regional society to another, don't just influence and determine the culture, but also are very often the source of misunderstandings and are the source of cultural differences and conflict between people from different cultures. So actually culture is a very wide-ranging concept, and just like jelly, it's very difficult to pin down. It wobbles, it moves around, it changes, and it's not something that's what we might call concrete in its composition. So to summarise that second point, that different views on the nature of reality, it's a term called ontology. For those of you who've done research methods, you may have heard of this. So our ontology leads us both as researchers, but also as practitioners and people in everyday life, to different ways of investigating that reality. So this is what's known as, it's a good word this, epistemology. So that those are the different ways of investigating the reality. So it means that when you're coming from a different paradigm, you will investigate, you will view, you will analyse, you will research the world in a different way than someone else from a different paradigm. You'll have your own particular view as to what the best approach is. Okay, so that's some quite heavy stuff for you, but what we can talk about here is that, or we can identify that most definitions of culture tend to relate to a number of different factors. And I've put quite a long list down there. People talk about patterns of behaviour, values, ways of doing things, even right the way down to there being a glue between individuals in a particular society. The second thing I want to point out here is that depending from where you come from, you probably have a different view of what culture is. So there are different definitions, or it runs deeper than definitions. It's almost an assumption of what a culture is. Now, from the British perspective, we can talk about culture, and when we're thinking about culture, people from Britain tend to think it helps to explain differences between groups and populations. So the idea is many people in the UK, in Britain, from this perspective, from this it leads on that these groups are at different stages of social and cultural development, and that comes from a sort of very imperial background, doesn't it? The view that certain societies and cultures are more developed than others. But it also means that when people are researching, investigating or analysing cultural issues, there is a tendency to assume that humanity is universal and it can be investigated via some frameworks. And in fact, we're going to be looking at weeks 2 and 3 at some of these different frameworks. It's what's known as an etic perspective, meaning that there's an external significance that's consistent and meaningful across different contexts. So we tend to get frameworks, models, typologies, comparative models of culture. Interesting, when we look at the German view, Kultur, so normally if you look in the dictionary they'll say that German for culture is Kultur, but actually when we dig beneath it, German people think quite differently about culture. Kultur is a Germanic idea that relates to the uniqueness of people, that history is a result of interactions between culturally distinct people. So, for example, people who share a language develop a similar subjectivity and sense-making of the world. What this all means is that it conflicts quite a lot with the British viewpoint. It's what's known as an emic perspective. Now, what that means is that meaning exists only within the context and experiencing the context, and it's very seldom transferable. I mean, we can extend this further to say, generally from a sort of British perspective, the viewpoint is that you can go in and investigate a culture from the outside objectively, whereas in Germany the view is quite different. In fact, the argument is that unless you're within the culture or at least experiencing it, it won't make any sense to you. You'll miss all the nuances and so on. So that's quite an interesting view, because it's very difficult for us working with German students to get to the bottom of this, but actually we're sometimes talking across purposes when we talk about culture. Now, organisation culture and business culture, which we're going to look at first of all here, there's actually a whole development of it. And in the lecture, I will talk through the sort of Japanization notion, how Japanese management thinking developed this view of how to consider cultures. And we've also got Peterson Waterman there, which was a big US study looking at some investor-run companies and trying to understand the excellence cultures of these organisations. And then the other book that you've got there is Deal and Kennedy, quite a landmark piece of work where they identified different types of corporate cultures. A lot of these books actually emerged in the 70s and the 80s. Now, there is a video to watch if you want to. After we sort of consider that, we'll probably watch it in the lecture. But it's all about Google's organisation culture as actually quite an extreme business culture. But when we think about culture, whether it's organisation culture, national culture, it's actually very useful to think about culture as being different layers. And in fact, a very famous piece of work by Edgar Schein in 1985 said that actually culture is like an iceberg. It's the iceberg model, the iceberg view of culture, saying that actually what you see on the surface is only part of it, that actually a lot of things about culture are hidden. So the things, the visible things that you see on the surface or above are the artifacts, the logos, the physical layout, the things you can see, the way people dress, the way they communicate and so on. But below the surface, there's actually the shared values of people, a lot more difficult to get into. So what are the norms when we work as a group? What are the differences in beliefs and so on? And then right deep below the surface, really difficult to get at, are the basic assumptions. These basic assumptions are the way that we see the world and shape the world. And in fact, we probably don't see our own assumptions as individuals or as shared people in society. You know, it's at the heart of some of the Brexit problems at the moment, isn't it? That many people in Britain really have certain assumptions and see the world in a completely different way than people in Europe and or on continental Europe. And a lot of the misunderstanding are because some of the assumptions are so deep-rooted that people believe that they're right and their view of the world is the correct one. Okay, so just to end today's the session for week 2, we're going to think about a particular typology, and this is what's known as Harrison's typology. Typology just means a framework where they identify different types of things. So Harrison's typology is, if you like, a categorization of different business cultures. And this piece of work was written in 1972 and was an early and important but early piece of work where somebody started saying, well, different organisations, different businesses have particular characteristics. And we've no need to spend a lot of time in looking at these, but the notion was that some cultures, there's a power culture, there's a single source of power, power resides at the top. Benefits are this gives you a quick response, but very much dependent upon the competence of the leader and of the person holding the power. So if you go to certain organisations, I don't know, police, people like that, the army, you will see that actually there's very much a power culture and a structure within that. There's role cultures, and this is what we often think of as the typical bureaucracies, where people have their own functional role to play, you have specialists, it's all broken down. And actually, you know, sometimes when people say, can you define or describe your organisation, people will draw out an organisation chart, which, you know, is their way of thinking of the organisation. They think about it as a set of different roles. Some organisations have a task culture. What this actually means is that they concentrate on the job of work and the outcomes. So what tends to happen here is that they identify that in their organisation there are certain things to be done, and there's a focus on the outcome. It tends to be very process orientated. They sort of learn methodologies or try and get to the outcome as quickly as possible, but obviously it relies upon a lot of expertise and flexibility, so power is there. So a lot of, for example, construction companies or big project companies or management consultants, you tend to find there that they tackle things on a project by project, task by task approach. Then finally, Harrison identified a person culture, and this is, you know, sometimes people identify themselves as a people person, but this is where the whole organisation, their primary existence is to serve the interests of their members, and members exercise influence over each other. So some business organisations are very people-based, but we think here particularly of things like charitable organisations, sports clubs, and things like this, where actually it's run for the benefit of the members rather than, say, corporations that are run for the benefit of profit or of shareholders and so on. Okay, so that's the first categorisation, which is quite an interesting thing to consider. The second categorisation is, we've already touched on it, the Deal and Kennedy typology, one of the influential books in the 1980s. So Deal and Kennedy, very similarly, identified 4 types of business cultures. The first one is what they call the tough guy macho culture. So some organisations seem to be very masculine, risk takers, receive immediate feedback, and we get here things like media organisations, the police, the army, some organisations where there's almost like a leader or a guru that everybody else should follow, should obey, and you know, it's a sort of situation where you tackle that. You get the feeling in Donald Trump's organisations there's very much this macho culture, and that's the way in which things are done. They said that some organisations, this was based upon research in the USA, some organisations displayed a work hard, play hard culture. So quite often these are low risk, quick feedback results in activity. So they were saying things like sales organisations and IT. It tends to be a situation where people will work extremely hard in an extremely focused way, but then let their hair down and sort of tackle things or socialise with one another and try and develop that sort of teamwork amongst one another. So the third one I identified was bet your company culture. What this means is to say that some cultures are very high risk. We've got here slow feedback, but it means that feedback is in the longer term, but massive reward. So we think about organisations involved in research and development projects, new products, new processes. Pharmaceutical companies could be of this particular type, spending a lot of money in tackling or trying to come up with new products, new cures, which may or may not work and so on, but actually betting a lot, risking a lot in their company. So some companies are characterised by the fact that they take on lots of risk in the way in which they do things, and it's not sort of comfortable in that way. And the final one is this sort of links very much with the role culture that Harrison was talking about. It's the process culture. So the classical Weberian, the Max Weber bureaucracy. So this is where individuals focus on process and roles and bureaucracy to see through things. So some organisations can be very frustrating when you go to them because they have to follow the rules or follow the processes to reduce risk in what they're doing. Okay, so those typologies are just offered to you just as a way of sort of identifying what sort of company things are. You might want to talk to your German clients and try and say what sort of, or try and identify with them whether you think that they are risk takers or not, what the sort of focus of the group is. What you'll find in any group of students, or between different groups, there are different ways of working and so on. Okay, so that's really what we're doing in week 2. It was all about putting a bit more flesh on the bones of what actually culture is, identifying that it means different things to different people, and certainly recognising there are differences around the world. But then I just wanted to identify, first of all, what we mean by business or corporate or organisational cultures, and to put forward 2 of the most well-known typologies or categorizations of business culture. Okay, I'll also record now week 3's material, just so that it gives you a heads up, gives you an early start on some of the material, so that when we get to the lecture, you're already quite informed. Probably can ask me questions on it as I'm delivering it in class.